First, let's look at the anatomy of the hamstrings. The hamstrings are a group of 3 individual muscles. These are the biceps femoris, the semitendinosus, and the semimembranosus. First, let's look at the biceps femoris muscle. It's difficult to see in this picture, but this muscle is actually composed of 2 parts, the long head and the short head. Both heads insert on a part of the fibula, which is one of the lower leg bones. But the difference between the 2 heads is that the long head originates on the pelvis, while the short head originates on the femur, the upper leg bone. Both the semimembranosus and semitendinosus have very similar anatomy. They both insert on the tibia or the shin bone. And like the biceps femoris, they both originate on the pelvis. Next, let's look at the functions of the hamstrings muscles. The hamstrings have 2 primary functions. First is to flex the knee. This is the action of bending the knee from a straight leg position. All hamstrings muscles contribute to this movement since they all cross the knee joint. And the other function they have is to extend the hips. This is the action of straightening the hips from a flexed position. All hamstrings muscles contribute to this movement apart from the short head of the biceps femoris, which is only a knee flexor. A relevant factor regarding the functions of the hamstrings is the biarticular muscle theory. This theory suggests that a muscle will not maximally contribute to a movement when 2 opposing actions are demanded. So if the movement requires a muscle to shorten at one end but lengthen elsewhere, it won't be trained all that well. This applies to all 3 hamstrings muscles as they are all biarticular by nature. They all extend the hip and flex the knee. Most practically relevant is for the role of the hamstrings during squat variations. When standing up from a squat, the hamstrings shorten at the hips. However, they are lengthened at the knees simultaneously. What this means is that the hamstrings aren't going to be trained very well from squats and squat variants. For example, this study compared the effects of squat training to different depths on muscle growth of the lower body. It was found that the hamstring saw minimal muscle growth from both squat training protocols. Furthermore, this study compared the effects of squats versus hip thrusts on lower body muscle growth. It was found that neither exercise was very effective for hamstrings hypertrophy since they both involve simultaneous hip and knee extension. Now that we have explored the functions of the hamstrings, let's look at what exercises are effective at training the hamstrings. There are 2 primary movement patterns which are going to be effective for training the hamstrings. The first are leg curls. This includes exercises such as seated leg curls, lying leg curls, kneeling leg curls, and Nordic hamstring curls. Leg curls pretty much isolate the hamstrings via their role of knee flexion. And since all hamstring muscles contribute to knee flexion, leg curls will train all hamstrings muscles. And the other exercise category are hip hinges. This includes exercises such as deadlifts, stiff leg or Romanian deadlifts, good mornings, hyperextensions, and reverse hyperextensions. The primary movement occurring during these exercises is hip extension. Hip hinges will train all hamstrings muscles apart from the short head of the biceps femoris, as it is the only hamstrings muscle which doesn't contribute to hip extension. It should also be noted that the glute max will also be trained significantly via hip hinges too. Next, let's explore some setup and technique considerations to help maximize hamstrings hypertrophy. We will discuss some tips for both hip hinges as well as leg curls. First, let's start with hip hinges. Here are a few setup and technique considerations unique to hip hinges for hamstrings growth. The first is the degree of knee bend we allow. This is mostly relevant for deadlift and good morning variations where there is some degree of simultaneous knee bend in addition to hip extension. Generally speaking, the more knee bend we incorporate, the more quadriceps we will involve and the less hamstrings. And the less knee bend we allow, the less quadriceps we will involve and the more hamstrings. This is for 2 primary reasons. First is that limiting knee bend will stretch the hamstrings under load to a greater degree. To maximally stretch the hamstrings, we want both hip flexion as well as knee extension. And in general, training a muscle in a more stretched position is usually favorable for muscle growth. And second is due to the biarticular muscle theory. Too much knee bend will cause the hamstrings to shorten at the hip but lengthen at the knee, involving 2 opposing muscle actions. And as we have discussed, this means the hamstrings probably aren't going to be trained quite as well. So as a practical recommendation, I would suggest limiting the amount of knee bend involved during relevant hip hinge exercises to maximize hamstrings muscle growth. A little knee bend is generally advisable since we may feel some nerve tension behind the knee if our knees are completely locked out. So allow a little knee bend, but try not to bend your knees any further as you go down. Another slightly more advanced setup consideration is to use a deficit during hip hinge movements like deadlift variations. Standing on plates or a block of some sort will increase the distance from the barbell to the floor, so you can achieve a greater range of motion before the plates touch the ground. This can get the hamstrings into an even greater stretch, potentially improving the hypertrophic stimulus. In most cases, this isn't going to be necessary since most people won't have the hamstrings flexibility to touch the plates to the ground using strict stiff leg deadlift technique. However, if you were very flexible or if you were shorter in stature, you might find that a deficit allows you to train through a greater range of motion than a standard setup allows. In these cases, adding a deficit could be a setup that you might benefit from. And the last technique consideration for hip hinges is for back extensions. More specifically, how we set up and execute the movement can influence which muscles are trained to what extent. Back extensions typically involve some degree of hip extension and spinal extension. And based on our setup and execution, we can bias either of these movements. When we perform back extensions with greater hip movement, we can bias the glutes and hamstrings to a greater magnitude. And when we perform them with greater spinal extension, we can bias the spinal erectors to a greater magnitude. To bias the glutes and hamstrings, we want to set up the hip pad below the hips so that we can achieve maximum hip flexion. In terms of technique, we want to keep the spine in a neutral or even flexed position and avoid extending the spine during the movement. To bias the spinal erectors, we want to set up the hip pad just above the hips so that they can't flex as much. And in terms of technique, we want to let the back round as we go down, then actively extend as we come up. However it is performed, the spinal erectors, glutes, and hamstrings will all work to some degree. These setup and technique changes may just allow us to emphasize which muscles are primarily targeted. Now let's look at some considerations for leg curls to maximize hamstrings hypertrophy. Here are a few technique considerations for leg curls. The first is the use of lengthened partial reps. It depends on the specific manufacturer, but most leg curl machines are going to be most challenging in the shortened position when the knee is flexed, and easiest in the lengthened position when the knee is straightened out. This isn't ideal because it means we are likely to fail in the shortened range first. This means we can usually perform a few more partial reps through the lengthened range of the exercise after reaching failure with a full range of motion. And it seems that partial reps performed in the lengthened range seem to be highly effective for muscle growth. This was established in this meta-analysis, which compared the effects of full versus partial range of motion resistance training on muscle growth. It was found that overall, full range of motion seems to be marginally favorable for hypertrophy compared with partial range. However, when partials are performed in the lengthened position, the evidence tends to find slightly superior growth using partial range of motion training. So by performing post-failure lengthened partials during most machine leg curls, we are able to achieve more reps each set in the most effective range of the exercise. This is likely to improve the hypertrophic stimulus of each set to a small magnitude. Obviously, this isn't applicable for some leg curl exercises, like Nordic curls, but it is usually the case for most machines. The second technique consideration for leg curls is our ankle position. More specifically, it is sometimes advised to either plantar flex or dorsiflex the ankle during leg curls, meaning to point our toes up or down. Some have hypothesized that our ankle position during leg curls could bias the hamstrings or calves to a greater extent. But does this really change which muscles are trained? This was investigated in this study, which compared the effects of performing lying leg curls with either a dorsiflexed or plantar flexed ankle position. It was found that acutely, there were no notable differences in muscle activity of either hamstring or calf muscles between the different ankle positions in both trained and untrained subjects. And more importantly, both positions resulted in similar increases in biceps femoris muscle thickness, with slightly superior results seen with the dorsiflexed ankle position, although this wasn't considered statistically significant. So it seems that whatever ankle position we perform leg curls with is going to be effective for training the hamstrings. There is a possibility that pointing the foot up in a dorsiflexed position may be slightly superior, although more evidence is needed to confirm this before we can be too confident in this claim. And a related technique consideration for leg curls is the rotation of our feet. In other words, should we keep our feet straight, point them inward, or point them outward while performing leg curls? This was investigated in this study, which compared hamstrings muscle activity when performing lying leg curls with the feet pointed inward, neutral, or outward. It was found that all regions of the hamstrings were highly active with all foot positions. However, internally rotating the feet slightly increased activation of the medial or inner hamstrings muscles, while externally rotating the feet slightly increased activation of the lateral or outer hamstrings muscles. So if you really wanted to bias the inner or outer regions of the hamstrings, it may be worth trying to manipulate your foot position to do so. This may be relevant for injury prevention, rehabilitation, or sports performance purposes. However, it probably isn't necessary to be too pedantic about which specific regions of the hamstrings are being biased for the purposes of pure hypertrophy training. So in most cases, I'd recommend defaulting to a standard neutral foot position. Then you can adjust this slightly if it feels more comfortable to rotate your feet, or if you want to slightly bias a specific region of the hamstrings. And finally, let's move on to some unique programming considerations for hamstrings training. There are two main programming considerations I can think of which are unique to hamstrings training. The first is the implementation of seated versus lying leg curls. Both exercises are effective for training the hamstrings, and they can pretty much be used interchangeably. However, if you have access to it, the seated leg curl may be slightly superior for overall hamstrings development compared with the lying leg curl. This was seen in this study, which compared the effects of performing the seated versus lying leg curl exercises on hamstrings muscle growth. It was found that both exercises were effective for hamstrings growth, but the seated leg curls resulted in slightly superior overall growth. It should also be noted that the only hamstrings muscle which saw similar growth from both exercises was the short head of the biceps femoris. The reason for these results is likely because seated leg curls train the hamstrings in a more stretched position compared with lying leg curls. When we are seated, the hips are flexed, so the hamstrings are lengthened at the hip joint. Whereas when we are lying face down, the hips are extended, so the hamstrings are shortened at the hip joint. And when all other factors are equated, it seems to be beneficial to train a muscle in a more lengthened position. This applies to all hamstrings muscles except for the short head of the biceps femoris, since its length isn't influenced by either the seated or lying position. And the other programming consideration worth mentioning is for proximity to failure. We may want to prescribe slightly different proximity to failure targets for different hamstrings exercises. More specifically, it may be wise to train slightly further from failure for some hip hinge movements and slightly closer to failure for most leg curl exercises. The reason for this is because it is very difficult to train the hamstrings to true muscular failure during exercises like stiff leg deadlifts and good mornings. Instead, we often end up compensating slightly as the hamstrings fatigue. We will usually start to bend our knees a little more, round our lower back a little bit, or cut depth slightly in order to keep performing more reps. And while some slight compensation isn't catastrophic, it may not be ideal to push through fatigue with a heavy load and compromised technique. So I would recommend training to what I like to call technical failure for these lifts. This means performing as many reps as you can until your technique starts to break down. If you start compromising form, you have reached technical failure and the set ends there. Whereas for leg curls, we can pretty much train to complete failure in a safe and effective manner. And as discussed earlier, we can even train beyond failure in some cases to potentially improve the hypertrophic stimulus. The reason for this is because muscular fatigue of the hamstrings will always be the limiting factor, since they are pretty much the only muscle group being significantly fatigued. It is also generally safe to do so since we aren't loading the joints in any injurious positions and the exercise is extremely stable.